introduced a test runner module. It's experimental, but this is a really good thing, in my opinion, for Node and the JavaScript community ecosystem, whatever you want to call it. If you've worked with JavaScript for a while, you're probably familiar with other test runners or testing frameworks, such as Mocha, Jasmine. More recently, Jest has taken over, and it seems to be the most common choice. There was also QUnit. This was the first testing framework that I came across in my career. So there's a lot of churn, right, in the JavaScript ecosystem. Every few years, sometimes even quicker, there's a new module that solves a problem slightly better than a module that came before it. And we see this with bundling. We see this with testing, Sass transpilation. This happens frequently, right? And this churn, I refer to it as reinventing the wheel, but slightly better. It is great, right? We want to have better wheels, but there is a knowledge overhead for learning these new iterations and hopping between teams, hopping between projects. Over time, you're going to have to learn the new APIs, the new configurations, the new architectures for these iterations. So when Node introduced the test runner, I was pretty excited because I would love to be able to join any team, work on any open source project, and already know how the testing is going to work. Having this standard library, this standard module, it's going to reduce the knowledge overhead. Hopefully, that's what I hope will happen. So I'm going to talk about the test runner. I'm going to run through some things on this documentation page. And if you're thinking about using the test runner, which I highly recommend you do, you should definitely come here as well on your own. Read through this page. You can do it in an hour or so. And just familiarize yourself. Start up a little side project, or maybe even refactor some tests in an existing project to use the test runner. It's actually really good. There's a lot of things you can do with the test runner that you're already familiar with the other options out there. So let's see. Yeah, another great thing about the standard library is it's more reliable. It's not going to change as much. I think breaking changes in the standard library are a lot less common, and it's less likely to be abandoned, right? Once it makes it into the standard library, it's going to be around until Node itself dies out, right, or becomes or becomes deprecated, isn't maintained anymore. So the churn, right, dependency management, maintaining the health of your dependencies. By using this, you have one less dependency to worry about for a really important part of your application or your code. So how do we use the test runner? I've got this test runner directory. I'm going to make a module here called test. And we're going to import test from node test. And test is just a function that takes a callback, or it takes you want to describe what your test is. So, and then you have this callback here. The syntax is it's similar to other, the other modules that I referred to. And we can just log something. And then how do we run our tests? There's a couple of different ways. One interesting way to do that is to run the script with Node, which I thought was cool because this is how JavaScript files work already. You don't have to learn anything different if you're just running a single test. But you can also invoke Node or run Node with a test option. Now the test option is pretty similar to the defaults you might be used to with something like Jest. if you look in the documentation, there's this section for the test runner execution model. It describes the defaults, the behaviors of how tests are run or found. My favorite is creating a directory named test, and then Node will recursively look through that directory for any JavaScript file. You've also got some naming conventions, so you could start your test files with test, or you can end your test files with test. You can also specify specific test files or directories just as additional arguments when invoking Node using the test option. For this video, and for just my personal preference, I'm going to roll with the test directory as well. So we'll make that. We'll just drop a directory in here, and then we'll move our fresh module down into it, and then we'll check it out. See, it's still running. So the defaults are really nice. I don't see much of a reason to stray from them. And one benefit of having a set of really nice defaults, right, is that, okay, now when I switch between teams, I can hopefully assume that they're using the same defaults, and I don't have to look at a configuration file and learn how these other folks do things. Everything is kind of just blanket similar. So let's write some more tests. We'll just write another one. So we'll test other things. We'll run that. You can see we're still passing. Now let's see what it looks like when we fail. Just to show you the output of a failure. So we can see we've got one failure, 2 tests. We can see the error that was thrown. Now I want to talk a little bit about the format of this output. If we get another success, you'll see tap version 13. So what is tap? Now I don't know too much about tap. I learned just enough to explain the basics. It's essentially just a format for testing output, or I guess a protocol. There's this website, testanything.org, and it's the test anything protocol. So I guess it kind of just defines a format that your testing runner can use, right? Or if you have a reporter, that's a separate module. If they both use the same format, then I suppose that allows both the test runner and the reporter to, they don't have to worry about depending on each other. They can just agree that, hey, we both use the tap format. You can use this separately, and I think it just opens up a lot more customization, less coupling. You've got something like Jest where the formatting, right, is probably very specific. I'm not sure exactly if Jest, I'm not very familiar with all the formatting options Jest has, but in the past I've written formatters for other testing frameworks, and generally their APIs are a little different, right? So you could have various test runners that all support the tap format. Well, in that case, you could share a reporter with those testing frameworks and save yourself some knowledge overhead. So that's the tap format. Let's see. What else do we want to cover here? Okay, let's talk about subtests. So we've got some simple tests here. Nothing Nothing sophisticated. We can even write some assertions. Assert true. Run that. Still passing, cool. But eventually, right, you're going to want to organize your tests a little bit better. You're probably not going to want to have a bunch of top level tests. Eventually, you're going to want to group things together with subtests. So how do you do that? Well, the test function, right, that we import out of the test runner module, the callback argument supports, or it passes an argument which is testing context, right? So this first argument here, it's just a context for, I would guess, the entire test suite. And if we look in here, test context, it's an object that it's got a number of things on it, right? We've got diagnostic, run only, signal. I'm not going to cover all of this stuff. You know, skip, you're probably used to this kind of thing in other test modules. But what we are going to look at is context.test. So this function is how you're going to define subtests, right? So it's just 3 arguments. You've got the name, right? So this is the string or the descriptor for the test. So if we wanted to move this test down here upwards into a subtest, we could just invoke t.test, right? Logging other things, and we will bring that thing up. And let's run that. Cool. So that's how you make subtests. So here's the first gotcha that I ran into. Let's say we wanted to have 2 subtests here. We'll call it other things. Now the syntax looks right, doesn't it? It looks like it should work, but what happens when we run this? It fails. Now why is this failing? If we scroll up a little bit here. Test did not finish before its parent was canceled. So what does that mean? Well, what it means is this second subtest was still running while this parent testing suite, or this parent test, canceled. It ended. So the parent ended before the subtest. And in that case, the test runner fails you, or it fails the test. And there's a line about this in the documentation. So if we read here, in this example, a wait is used to ensure that both subtests have completed. This is necessary because parent tests do not wait for their subtest to complete. Any subtests that are still outstanding when their parent finishes are canceled and treated as failures. Any subtest failures cause the parent test to fail. So if you want to have more than one subtest, I'm not sure why it works with one, you have to use async await. Now that is a little inconvenient, but asynchronous logic in JavaScript is oftentimes inconvenient. So let's just use async await here. And we're going to await both of our subtests. If we run that, now we're passing. Cool. So that's one gotcha. Here's another. How do we use lifecycle hooks, right? So with these other modules that we've used in the past, most of them have had lifecycle hooks that we can use. And if we just do some text searching here, as far as I can tell, there's no lifecycle hooks that the test runner give us, or that the test runner has available. Like we can search lifecycle. I've searched through this documentation. I don't see anything about lifecycle hooks. So how do we perform some logic before tests or after tests or before each? You kind of just have to use JavaScript on its own. So what would we do, right? We would say before all, and then maybe we just wanted to have some simple setup, right? That's not defined though. So another way we could do this is simply just put the logic directly in the testing sphere, or the parent test. I mean, that's still gonna work, right? And we're already in an async function, so maybe you wanted to make a directory. So we could just make a directory right here. If we swing back over, foobar, right? Well, what if we wanted to have some cleanup? Okay, easy peasy. Right? Just delete that directory because you can't create a directory that already exists. Check that out. And look at that. Set up, tear down. Now, there's probably some limitations here, or maybe there's not. I haven't used the test runner enough to be confident that this is the best way to do things, but this is one way I've worked around it. So what if we wanted to do something different, right? What if we wanted to have some setup and teardown for each test, or for each subtest? One way I've accomplished that is just using a higher order function where we return a function, right? And we pass in some testing context, right? So for each test, if I wanted to create and remove a foobar directory, I could do something like this. It's just a higher order function, so how would I use this? We could just wrap this in setup, right? And we can make this an async function as well. Potentially, I'm not even sure. Yeah, we'll make that an async function as well. So check it out. We've got passes. And let's say we want to see this actually working. We can just leave the directory hanging around, foobar, right? So although it's a little, it can be a little tedious, right? Because now I can't just say, all right, well, before all or before each, I can't just define this logic in a lifecycle function and then have the framework do the work. I do actually have to wrap each test. And it kind of reminds me of Express middleware. I mean, I know a higher order function is a simple concept, but the simplicity of Express middleware, you know, I can't remember what the middleware exactly was called. We got a failure here. This might be because those are running concurrently. Or wait, no. Maybe I need. async here as well. Oh, you'll also notice that potentially, yeah, the foobar directory is still there, right? So this isn't a silver bullet. There's still things to solve here. So for example, if you're running your test, if you're awaiting your test, like what if your test fails? Like what if an assertion throws or there's some other error? You're not exactly going to get to this line. You'll have to add try-catch logic and make sure that your test cleans up properly. But there we go, now it's passing after I cleaned up that foobar directory. So this gives you lifecycle hooks. This gives you setup, ways you can set up and tear down, right? So I could, I'm just making a directory here. Like I could make database calls. I could start child processes here as well. Any asynchronous logic is going to work. And then you're also going to understand exactly how your error handling is. Let's see, what else do we want to cover? So I'm not going to show examples of this, but just because it's pretty simple. You've got only, skipping. If you're watching this video, I'm just assuming that you've written JavaScript tests in the past. You've got the behavioral syntax, to do functions. One interesting thing that I saw, and I'm not sure, maybe Jest supports this already, but I thought it was cool that you could use skips or only in the second argument for the test function, right? So you can specify this object here. It's almost like a configuration object where you can use only, you can use skip, you can use to do. I think you can use to do in that object. I thought that was interesting because then you could use like environment variables, for example, directly in your test if you wanted to have, if you had some complicated CI where you were skipping certain tests for certain environments. But I think that's pretty much all I wanted to cover. Definitely, I highly encourage any JavaScript developer to check out the test framework or the test runner. Give it a try, start using it. Let's just all agree that the standard library is good enough so that we can all stop learning new stuff to solve the same problems we've had since the beginning. So that's it. Thanks for watching.